The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 in Europe, occasionally dated as 1315 to 1322, was the first of a series of large-scale social crises that hit Europe in the early 14th century, causing millions of deaths over a large number of years, thus marking the end of an earlier period of prosperity on the continent during the 13th century. Starting with bad weather in the spring of 1315, climatological change ended up promoting universal crop failures between the spring of 1315, accentuating in the summer of 1316 until the summer of 1317. Welcome to the Myths and Curiosities channel. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any notifications. Europe did not fully recover until 1322. It was a period marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, and infanticide. There were consequences for the Catholic Church, the nation-states, the demography of the continent, and European society as a whole. The Great Famine of 1315 helped to potentiate the future calamities of the 14th century. Famine in the medieval European context meant that people died of starvation on a large scale. Though brutal, famines were familiar occurrences in medieval Europe. For example, localized famines occurred widely in France during the 14th century. In England, the most prosperous kingdom affected by the Great Famine, there were famines in 1315 to 1317, 1321, 1351, 1369, and beyond. For most people, there was not enough to eat and life was relatively short. According to the records of the British royal family, the best and most affluent in society, the average life expectancy in 1276 was between 28 and 35 years. Between 1301 and 1325, during the Great Famine, it was 29 to 84 years old, while during the Black Death it dropped to 17 to 33 years. The Great Famine was restricted to Northern Europe, including the British Isles, northern France, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, Germany, and western Poland. It also affected some Baltic countries, except the Far East, which was only indirectly affected. The famine bordered the Alps and Pyrenees. During the medieval warm period before 1350, there was a population explosion in Europe, reaching levels that in some places would not be repeated until the 19th century. Parts of France are less populous today than in the early 14th century. But wheat production rates, the number of seeds a person could consume per seed planted, had been falling since 1280 and food prices were rising. In good weather, the rate was 7 to 1, while in bad years it went down to 2 to 1, that is, for every seed planted, 2 seeds were harvested, 1 for the next year, and 1 for food. By comparison, modern agriculture has rates of 200 to 1 or more. There was a catastrophic deterioration in weather during the medieval period, which coincided with the onset of the Great Famine. Between 1310 and 1330, Northern Europe had one of the longest periods of bad weather in all of the Middle Ages, characterized by harsh winters and cold, rainy summers. Unstable weather patterns, the inability of medieval governments to deal with crises, and overly large population levels made this an era with a high possibility of a full-scale crisis. In the spring of 1315, above-normal rains fell over most of Europe. Through spring and summer, it continued to rain and the temperature remained cold. Under these conditions, the grains did not germinate. The grains were taken to silos in urns and pots. Feed for the animals could not be cured, so there was no feed for the cattle. Food prices started to rise. Prices in England doubled between spring and midsummer. Salt, the only way to cure and preserve meat, was hard to come by, because the water didn't evaporate in wet weather. It jumped from 30 to 40 shillings. In the province of Lorraine, wheat rose by 340% and peasants could no longer afford bread. Grain stocks for long-term emergencies were limited to nobles and lords only. Even in the face of population pressures, still above average harvests showed that some would go hungry. People began to gather edible roots, plants, and nuts, among other foods, in the forests. There are a number of documented incidents that show the extent of the famine. In one, Edward II stopped at St. Albans on August 10, 1315, and there was no bread for him or his court. It was one of the rare occasions that the King of England went without food. The French, under Louis X, tried to invade Flanders, but being a region of the Low Countries, the fields were so soaked that his army was bogged down and forced to retreat, burning the provisions they could not carry. In the spring of 1316, it continued to rain on a European population lacking the energy and reserves to sustain itself. All segments of society, from nobles to peasants, were affected, but especially peasants, who made up 95% of the population, and who lacked a social safety net. To provide some relief, the future was sacrificed, killing breeding animals, consuming crop seeds, abandoning children, and, among the elderly, voluntarily denying food to give hope to the younger generations to survive. Chronicles of the time describe many incidents of cannibalism. The peak of the famine was reached in 1317 when the wet weather ended. Finally, in the summer, the weather returned to its normal pattern. However, the people were so weakened by diseases such as pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis, and so much of the seed stocks had been consumed, that it was not until 1325 that food levels returned to relatively normal pre-famine conditions. Historians debate the number of fatalities, but it is estimated that between 10% to 25% of the population of many cities and towns perished. While the Black Death, 1338 to 1375, would kill more in real numbers, for many, the Great Famine was worse, on the social issue of calamity. While the plague annihilated an area in a few months, the Great Famine lashed out for years, dragging out the suffering of people who slowly starved to death, faced cannibalism, infanticide, and uncontrolled crime. The abnormal weather patterns were similar to those found in volcanic eruption events such as Mount Tambora in 1816, which caused the year without a summer in Europe. It is reported that there was an eruption at Mount Pinatubo in 1315. The loss of prestige of the Catholic Church was one of the main casualties. In a society where religion was the main resource in the face of a crisis, prayers had no effect against the circumstances, which weakened the prestige and authority of the institution. This helped to generate the appropriate climate for the emergence of movements later condemned as heretical by the Church, because they opposed the papacy and blamed the catastrophes on the Church's corruption. Medieval Europe in the 14th century had already experienced widespread social violence, and even then, punishments with the death penalty such as rapes and murders were demonstrably much more common, especially in relation to the population, compared to the modern times. The famine led to a stark increase in crime, even among those not normally inclined to criminal activity, who would resort to any means necessary to survive and feed themselves and their family. After the famine, Europe took on a harder and more violent edge. It became an even more hostile place than during the 12th and 13th centuries. Famine also undermined confidence in medieval governments, which failed to deal with its resulting crises. The Great Famine marked a clear end to an unprecedented period of population growth that had begun around 1050. Although some believe that growth had already been slowing down for a few decades, the famine was undoubtedly a clear end to high population growth. The Great Famine would have consequences for future events, in the 14th century, such as the Black Death, when an already weakened population would be attacked again. We are now in the 21st century, experiencing a climate and environmental crisis. We need to prepare for what the future holds, but one thing is for sure, the world has experienced everything we are experiencing now. Already leave your like and take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.